Though you'll be exposed to quite a few cultural examples in your course text, I would like to focus for a moment on one particular ethnographic example that has really been studied extensively since the mid-20th century, and that is the Nuer people, a Nilotic people, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment, of the central and southern Sudan. The Nuer are a very good ethnographic example for a variety of reasons, especially those associated with this cultural branch of anthropology. However, today we are going to focus on the Nuer in relation to body art. When we refer to the Nuer as a Nilotic people, and again we have to think of them historically because today they are refugees spread throughout most of northern and eastern Africa, we do find pockets of the Nuer in the Sudan and the surrounding region, including Ethiopia. However, the Nuer have been physically removed from their traditional homeland due to warfare and due to government strife. The term Nilotic refers to a people who, in this case a language tradition and a people, who have historically been associated with the watershed of the Nile River. So when you think of dynastic Egypt, again, another very good example of a political system, a culture, a community that is part of our global history today and drives many of our interests with regards to archaeology and archaeological study. The ancient Egyptians would be considered to be a Nilotic people as well. In terms of a subsistence strategy to associate with the historic Nuer, I'd like you to assign them the label agropastoralism, or consider them to be agropastoralists. This means that their livelihood or their lifeway, in terms of this historical point of view, has been a combination of not only pastoralism, and we see this with cattle, with goat, but also agriculture. We see this with corn and with millet. So let's take a moment to flush out this term, looking at the combination of concepts. In this case, let's start out with agriculture. So agriculture in this case is going to be a system of plant cultivation, or it'll be a plant cultivation economy characterized by continuous and very intensive use of land and of labor. Pastoralism, as I've already mentioned, is also a food-producing strategy or a subsistence strategy. In this case, one that is really rooted on the care of herds, specifically domesticated animals. And it's not specifically one species of domesticate, but a pastoralist generally will have a combination of species within a single herd. Now, the particular kind of ritual that I want to focus in on today, in this case body art, associated with Nuer, really falls under this practice of scarification, or the highly ritualized routine cutting of skin, creating a kind of subdermal scar tissue that can be patterned in a variety of ways. If you take a closer look at this particular PowerPoint slide, you can see a Nuer woman who has a scarified pattern that is expressed on her face. Women have a different use for scarification. It is something associated with not only femininity, but beautification as well. We'll take a look and contrast that with a scarification among men in this Nuer example in just a moment. The first thing that I want to establish with you is this concept of a rite versus a practice, because this is the real separation between how body art is expressed between, in this case, men and women among the historic Nuer. A rite in this case is a strictly culturally defined activity that is associated in this case with a transition or a life event. Again, it is a practice that is important for one to navigate from one stage of life to another. Probably the best way of looking at this is associated with the different rites of passage, even in our own culture, that are associated with joining a community or becoming an adult. Scarification, rather, for women, again, the intentional mutilation of skin tissue, often in a patterned nature, is not a rite. However, it does have a symbolic representative quality to it. In this case, many of the patterns that we see, really not best represented by this particular image that is associated with this PowerPoint slide. However, some of the images associated with the torso of women really represents their bond to not only cattle, but also to a system of wealth among the Nuer. And again, if you are to read more closely in your course text, the information regarding the Nuer, what you will find is that cattle, or the herd itself, at least that aspect of the herd that is comprised of cattle, really is the foundation for their traditional or historic economy. And as I had mentioned rather a little bit earlier, it is also associated with beautification and femininity. Now this makes it more of a practice than a ritual. It's not something that is required to navigate from one stage of life to another or transition from one aspect of livelihood or lifestyle to another. However, for men it is. Male scarification, best represented by the ritual of receiving one's marks of Gar, and a phonetic way of spelling Gar would be G-A-A-R. This is a rite of passage. It is a scarification ritual, again, not pictured here, but one that marks, in this case, the forehead, and it really represents a individual's transition from boyhood to manhood. At this time, even the young man's name will change. He will be named after the pattern of his favorite ox, or an ox that is gifted to him. And he is recognized as becoming a man with all of the associated responsibilities at that very moment. And the scarification, in a sense, really becomes a symbol of that transition or that navigation from one life stage to the next. I've included this map of the surrounding area to give you an idea of the region of Africa that we're looking at in this example of the Nuer. Again, when we talk about a Nilotic people, these would be a community of individuals, a culture, for example, that is associated historically with the watershed or the drainage system of the Nile River. And we find Nilotic peoples throughout Egypt, throughout the Sudan, portions of Ethiopia. So just take a moment to familiarize yourself with where the Sudan is, its overall geography, its relationship to some of the surrounding countries, and where it is in relation to the Nile River and its floodplain. Now let's take a look at, in this case, body art as it relates to what our experiences have been on a sociological and a cultural level. What you will find when you step back and really look at this particular expression of art in our own society, in our own culture today, and the recent historical past, you'll find that it is less of a rite of passage or a cultural rite and more of a preferred individual practice associated with fads and sentiments. As you begin to peer deeper into the sentimentality behind the practice of body art, in this case a very common practice of body art in our own society today in the West, is tattooing. One finds that it can also take on a expression of resistance, breaking social norms, pushing social norms to their breaking point. Beyond this, it can also be utilized to symbolize one's membership within a community, to represent a time of life that was shared with others. One very common expression of this is military service. From an anthropological point of view, though, when we think about representations having to do with body art. Generally, things like tattooing, piercing, scarification, these are all recognized and should be classified as symbolic behaviors. Anthropologists who have looked at this topic more closely in their own research, Daniel Rosenblatt, Andrea Juno, these are just two examples that you don't necessarily have to remember for this class or the upcoming examination. However, they are very good examples for anthropologists who have looked into this. They really recognize, in this case, body art as a kind of decorative process that has strong, significant, symbolic meanings that are often tied to it. Rosenblatt and others have added an additional level of meaning to body art, in this case, that it also represents a kind of global reflection on what it means to be human and how we are inseparable from our past. Some have said that this is a glorification or a Western popularization of notions of tribalism. I don't believe, however, that we should tie it to a human universal or a historical universal in the human experience. However, I do believe that our understanding of what the body is, how we perceive it, and how we imagine it and reimagine it, that is very important to give us a deeper understanding of human psychology over its very long history. Here's another historical, or in this case prehistoric, example for you to think about as you ponder this notion of body art as a practice and as a ritual. This particular image is associated with the archaeology of the southwestern coast of what is today modern Greenland. The Qiliqtsuq site is extremely important with regards to not only preservation but ancient human ritual. In 1972, 8 bodies were recovered from this site, all dating to the end of the 15th century. What archaeologists eventually were associated with was the content of 2 graves, and these 2 particular mass graves are important to us as we look at body art and ritual. Aging in this case was done by looking at dental implements, in this case dental eruption, dental development, and dental wear. What archaeologists eventually found is that they had 3 women in their late 20s associated with 3 women in their late 50s. And again, the women in their 50s are the individuals who demonstrated evidence of facial tattooing. There was 1 infant and then 1 young boy, approximately 4 years of age. As I had mentioned, only the women in their 50s presented archaeologists with evidence of facial tattoos. Many have, again, postulated what these particular markings could be. However, most archaeologists, anthropologists looking at the Qiliqtsuq material recognize them as possible marks for descent and group affiliation. 2 of the women in this case shared identical tattoos, so this really brings that notion of descent into the conversation. And then DNA and congenital growth and development evidences have also informed archaeologists that the 2 that shared these particular facial tattoos may have been related by birth. In this case, they may have been sisters. So again, what we're seeing here in this archaeological example from the late 15th century in Greenland is that tattooing really played more of a role in terms of identifying who an individual was and their group affiliation than individual interest, sentiment, or any sort of temporary fad. We also recognize that these particular kinds of markings were associated in this archaeological example with women, but men could have expressed this as well, but that they were women of a similar age group. And that's another thing that we really need to keep in mind as we take a close look at this example in relation to this topic. Our final living example takes us back to Micropolynesia and the island nation of Tonga, in this case in eastern New Ireland. New Ireland and New Britain are two groupings of islands associated with Melanesia and Micropolynesia that we really recognize as part of that eastern border of the Bismarck Archipelago. In this case, much of the body art we associate with the Tanganese people really is above the waist, specifically having to do with the face in this case. So again, like our Kelikotsak example, the Tanganese practice a kind of facial focus when they're expressing body art, specifically when they are involved in the practice of tattooing. And the term tattoo or tatau is actually a Polynesian term, so it's important that we end our conversation with this example from the Pacific. So let's begin by asking, who does the tattooing? Who are the tattooing practitioners? In this case, when we look at the Tanganese, we realize that women are almost solely the tattooing practitioners, and this is very different when we compare the tattooing practices of New Ireland to what we see in New Britain and further east throughout the Pacific. In this case, we recognize powdered ash as being a very important element in the tattooing process. And this ash is produced from burning local plants of a variety of species in Tanga itself. In this case, then, an incision is made into the skin, and this colored ash is rubbed into the cut mark. As is the case with the application of color in our own tattooing practices here in the United States, the tattooee, in this case, has the choice to return to receive additional designs or to complete designs that were started at an earlier session. Tattoos, in this case, in this Tanganese example, can take several months. The facial designs that, again, have been studied by anthropologists since the mid-20th century among the Tanganese people really relate to things like gender, age, and then group affiliation. These particular images here are depictions of men. Men have the most specific expressions of tattooing patterns associated with the face. When we do see tattooing among Tanganese women, they're much more decorative and elaborate in nature, very similar to the kind of pattern that we saw among the Nuer. However, neither are really focused on a rite of passage. In this case, gender, age, and group affiliation. That really is the driving force behind the practices that we see in this part of Polynesia. So kinship is very important for understanding the patterns that we see in this particular expression of body art. And then marriage rituals, and marriage relationships are also very important in understanding the patterns that are recorded, are seen. In conclusion, then, let me just emphasize a few key concepts in relation to this notion of group affiliation and body art. So the Tanganese people, the people of modern Tanga and historic Tanga, have in their modern expression and in their historic or traditional expressions, have adhered to a system of descent which kind of governs all life, in this case that Polynesian clan that we were talking about in our last lecture. And then when we look at more closely their symbolic expressions, including body art, we realize that this really reflects an individual's or a art carrier's association to this larger historical or traditional system. Then within that very complex historical and traditional system, we can then see some nuances of individual affiliation according to the various styles that the art expresses. So in this case, and here's a couple additional terms for you to keep in your notes, we recognize variations in body art style associated with consanguineal relationships and affinal relationships. So consanguineal relationships according to modern anthropologists, are those relationships that are determined by blood. So these are blood relatives. So blood relatives will express a similar kind of facial art. Within this tradition, we see even greater similarities among males who are consanguineal in relation to one another. So, or another way of putting it, male cognates or cognates in general. Cognates are male consanguinean relatives. And then, as I said just a moment ago, the other pattern that we see are among people who are related through marriage ties or affinal ties. So these kinship understandings, these group affiliations, these traditions all unlock the patterns that anthropologists have, cultural anthropologists in this case, have historically witnessed among these Tonganese people, or this specific Micro-Polynesian example.